Hello, students. Here we are again. I did find out, and I guess you know by now, of course, that we won't be getting back together for classes before the end of the year, which really makes me sad that I won't be able to see y'all and finish up the way I wanted to. And of course, there's our whole rat dissection thing, right? So, it's a bummer. It's just the way things are this year, and I apologize, and I hope we can finish strong, okay? So, in the old days, normally what I do is I move module 16 forward. And the reason I do that is because I have a few labs to do for 16, which is the nervous system, and don't have any labs for some of 15, which are some of the more, I don't know, the lesser known systems in our body. And that's why the rat dissection, of course, fit in there so nicely. So I just thought I'd go ahead and keep it the way we had scheduled it originally. So here we go. All right, we're looking at the human nervous system. I'm going to bring up a little thing here. This is going to show our brain, and it's going to color these parts in. So you'll see there is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. All right, so this is just, we're going to get into what all those parts do and how that works and that kind of thing. I just wanted to put that up there to show, we are looking at the brain today. So our general overview, you're going to write this down, is that the nervous system is broken into two large groups. We have the central nervous system, known as the CNS, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is the PNS, which includes the nerves going away from the central nervous system. So the brain and the spinal cord are sort of sending out the messages, and the nerves are taking them out. And then we divide that into more groups called the autonomic, the somatic, the sensory. We'll get to all of that. It's a little more complex that way, oddly, seeing as how we're talking about brain science here. So I have this. It'll show you right here the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Let's wait for it to come back. There's the spinal cord. So the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. Peripheral, look at all those nerves coming out, going to all the parts. So you're out from the spinal cord to the rest of your body right there. Okay. Messages from the brain travel throughout the body through nerves. That's the blank you're filling in right there. This picture right here shows the brain. And then, you couldn't really see it this way, of course, but we're looking at the cells of the brain, okay, the neurons. This isn't completely accurate, but it's good enough, okay, for what we're doing right now. And so the brain is going to send the messages, and the nerves are going to deliver the messages to whatever part of the body the brain said. Like if you're going to move your hand to write down some notes, then that muscle will be contacted by the brain to say, start moving your hand to write down the word nerves in your blank, okay? This is a little close-up of the neuron. The neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system. That's a really good quiz question right there. So if I ask you what is the functional unit, meaning the thing that does the work of the central nervous system, of the nervous system in general, you would say it is the neuron. Now remember when we were learning first about cells, and we drew cells, and you actually made that cool little keychain, right, of the cell? When we draw an animal cell, we draw them round, and when we draw a plant cell, we draw them square. All right, well, this is an animal cell. Does it look very round to you? Oh, no. This is a very, very specialized cell, and it is called a neuron. So let's start here. This is the cell body right here, also called the soma, S-O-M-A, just means body, and you see the nucleus right there. Okay, so this is the main part of the cell. And these parts out here that are reaching out, branching out, are called dendrites. The word dendrite actually means tree or tree-like, okay? Now imagine these yellow things are not there. The cell then stretches out this long arm called the axon and then ends with these little terminals, the axon terminal. These yellow things are actually separate cells that are clinging on to the axon. So the Schwann cell is right here. It's part of what are known as the neuroglia. We'll get to those in a minute. And they're producing this substance called myelin. And they're making something known as the myelin sheath. And I want you to think of these neurons as a little electrical system, okay? Because electricity is going to start here in the soma, and it's going to run all the way down the axon and end at the terminals and be touching something. It'll either be touching another neuron or it will be touching a muscle, okay? So if you think of this like a wire, like a wire, with electricity running through it. Think of these cells as like the plastic over the wire. So when we have wire bringing light to our houses and stuff, the wire has plastic on it, and the plastic is to keep the wires from touching each other, from warming up too much. It's basically an insulator, okay? So it insulates them. So think of that myelin sheath like that. It actually helps to increase the speed of the signal as it goes down the axon. It gets into a lot of really specific details about an exchange of certain ions that take place. Fortunately for this class, you don't need to know all that biochemistry. Someday, if you take Biology 2 with me, which is called A&P, or Anatomy and Physiology, we spend the whole year on the human body and get into some serious detail. And one of the concepts is something called the sodium-potassium pump, which allows a signal to travel down the axon. And it's kind of tough science, but so fascinating. I'm not sure if there's a place in your book where you're supposed to draw this, but if there's not, can you find a little place, please, to draw this and label the parts? You can pause the video to take your time to draw it. Go ahead and label everything that's on here, okay, including this node of Ranvier. The node is just a little place in between the myelin sheaths, okay? So it's like a little spot. What happens is the electrical signal can actually jump over these, go jump, 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 and that's how it makes the signal travel down faster over the node to the nodes of each of the nodes of Ranvier. Ranvier, of course, is a person who discovered that and got named for it. Okay, like I said, you can pause this to draw that if you like. This is a little animation. It's taken those Schwann cell myelin sheath away, which is kind of nice. So it shows you we have the origination of the signal from here. It's called the hillock, and it travels down the axon up to here. Okay, so that's how it only goes one way, by the way. All right. There are 3 types of neurons. One is sensory. These are for the senses. The sense of touch, taste, all that kind of stuff. So pain, temperature, taste, cold, touch, all those kind of things are found in the neurons that are the sensory neurons. Motor neurons will stimulate, muscles, all types of muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay, so the motor neurons are touching those and stimulating them. And interneurons, also known as association neurons, these are neurons that are touching other neurons. They're either connecting to another neuron through the sensory to the motor, or just motor ones all connected together, or sensory ones all connected together. Okay, so the other neurons, the sensory and motor neurons, they're going to be, for instance, these would be touching the muscles, and so would these, right? And these would be touching another neuron. All right. When they touch another neuron or the muscle, they meet at a spot that's very specialized, okay? It's not like the wires. You remember from other science classes where in order to get a circuit to go, we had to connect the wires, and if the wires were not connected, the circuit wouldn't complete. Well, it's kind of different here. All right, God has this really amazing little design that he's come up here with, and it's called a synapse. So when the end of the axon, the axon terminus right here, gets to the end, it's going to touch, let's say this is a muscle right here that's going to be stimulated by a signal from the brain, right, telling it to move or whatever. What happens is the electrical signal makes its way down here, and it actually excites and turns on something called a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is typically one called acetylcholine. You don't need to know that, but it gets turned on, and the chemicals now get put into a little synaptic vesicle that came from the Golgi apparatus or something, and it's going to be released. So instead of an electrical signal hopping over here, this little gap in between, they're not touching, okay? There's a gap. It's called a synaptic gap. There's actually a chemical release here. So the chemical comes out, and it binds with a message receiver here on the other side. So let's say this is the muscle. So this is a receptor that is sensitive to the acetylcholine. It causes this little receptor to open up. It's like a little door opening. And when that door opens, what happens is there are some little ions that can run in here, typically calcium ions, which can then start the action potential or the signal, the electric signal in the muscle. All right, so it's like an extra step that God put in there just to show off, I guess, right? So, what I want you to know is that neurons exchange information at the synapse by neurotransmitters. So it goes from an electrical charge to a chemical charge back to an electrical charge. Okay, very fancy. And these never actually touch. There's a space right there, a gap right there. There's a little, this is a little animation of that. The signal comes down, it causes the acetylcholine to come down and open up the little gate. You see, it kind of showed that spark there. And then the acetylcholine actually goes back up to be reused later. It's like a recycle program here. And when this little gate gets opened up, I want you to notice how this little gate's going to change. Okay, see, it's sort of barrel shaped now, and then it'll kind of turn sort of, I don't know, flower shaped, right? That makes it available to accept like calcium ions or something, which will cause that signal to start in the muscle beneath there. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so in addition to the neurons that are in our nervous system, we have some other cells called neuroglia. I mentioned it briefly a minute ago. The neuroglia are the helper cells. They assist the neurons. Okay, there are various things that they're doing to help the neurons. So one of them here is the astrocyte. Astro means star, and here it is holding on to a neuron. Okay, and it is just assisting it. We'll see in a minute toward the end of the lecture, we'll talk about something known as the blood-brain barrier, and the astrocyte helps with the structural support of the neurons and helps to regulate the blood-brain barrier. The oligodendrocyte is the specialized name of the cell that is the Schwann cell that we saw. The Schwann cell is in the PNS. The oligodendrocyte is in the CNS. It's the same thing, though. It's making this myelin sheath that it's putting along the axon to protect it from, electrical charges. Next, we have the microglia. The microglia are wandering around looking for bacteria that may have got to the brain. I don't know if you know that brain infections are pretty rare, and that's because these guys are doing such a great job. Okay, you don't have to write this one down, but the ependymal cells, there are two different kinds, really. There's the plain ones and then the ciliated ones, and what they're doing is they're helping to move along something known as cerebrospinal fluid, which we'll get to in just a minute. So these cells are helping to regulate the environment of the brain. Okay, so they're not really doing the thinking or anything. They're just helping the cells that do the thinking. The neurons are doing the thinking. All right. So what is a nerve exactly? So out of the spinal cord, what happens is that the cells that are those axons, right? They are the soma, the cell body with the axon coming out of it. They'll all line up together, all right? And that long axon will end up being bundled together in and when it's bundled, see, it'll be bundled here and then bundled in another group and then bundled in another group, and so we have this giant bundle of nerves. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those giant electrical cables. They get really huge. That's similar to what a nerve is. Some nerves are bigger than others. Some of our big ones for like big muscle movement and stuff will require large nerves, and if a surgeon goes in and surgically, you can see these. You can see the nerves. They're visible because they're all bundled together. They look like a giant white shiny shoelace. They're kind of flattened out a little bit. And so, of course, as a surgeon's going to be real careful to avoid cutting a nerve, right? So essentially, the cell is called a fiber, right? So we made up of the axons. And a fiber is made up of many axons, and put those together, that becomes the nerve. I mentioned this earlier about the cerebrospinal fluid. It turns out that our brain is roughly two sides, right? So two hemispheres, they're called. We have the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. And right in the middle, there are actually these holes. There's holes in your brain. And there's 4 of them, 2 large ones and 2 smaller ones. And they're actually called ventricles. That should be familiar. Remember ventricles in the heart, right? So those ventricles are constantly manufacturing and sending out this fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, and it is being manufactured here in the holes here, right, the ventricles, and being pushed along the brain all the way, and then being pushed down the spinal cord. Okay, and then eventually it gets dumped into the blood system. But they're constantly making it. Now, why would the fluid be around the brain, okay? Cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the brain to protect it. What I do at this point in time, I should have thought about doing this for our lab, but I usually will bring in a jar, and the jar will have a raw egg in it. And then it's got a lid on it, right? So then I would ask one of you to volunteer to shake the jar. What do you think would happen to that egg? Well, of course, it would just break. And that's true. That's what happens. But then I have another jar just like it with another egg filled, and the jar is filled with water. So what do you think happens then when I shake the jar? The egg doesn't break. Yeah, I've had students try really hard to break that egg in there. I think one of my students got it to crack a little bit. But the idea here is that fluid is protecting your brain. Just like that water was protecting that egg, it keeps it from being able to be, smashed or otherwise injured. If you've ever known somebody, or maybe you have had a concussion before, what happens typically is you hit like the back of your brain. You'll like say a football player gets hit kind of hard. The back of the brain will kind of hit up against the back of the skull here and squeeze some of that fluid out of here. So it kind of I hate to say it this way, but it sticks to the back of the brain. All right, and that is one form of the way that a concussion can take place. And then it takes time for the fluid to squeeze back into its place and get it all taken care of, I guess over time, many concussions can cause, damage to the brain, some brain damage. So we got to take care of our brains, don't get a concussion. There are types of matter, and the way they look a little different. If you were actually looking at a brain, the matter does actually look gray and white. So we have gray matter and white matter. So what's the difference? Over here you can see in this picture, the gray matter looks kind of darker and the white matter looks lighter, right? Okay, so they are gray and white. The gray matter is actually made up of the cell bodies. You remember on the cell it had where the nucleus was, called the soma? If we kind of collect all of our cells and have all the somas lined up together, those cell bodies, they end up looking gray. And then the white matter, the axons, as they stretch out, okay, with all that myelin sheath and stuff on there, they kind of collect together and they look white. All right, so the gray matter is what we call the thinking part of the brain, and the white matter would be the communicating part of the brain. So the thinking is happening in the gray. So typically I like to compare it to my computer. My computer is here, it's doing the work, it's doing the thinking, but it's got these wires coming out, like I have a wire coming out to my microphone, I have a wire going to my printer, I have a wire going to my keyboard, I have a separate keyboard over here, and so the wires would be the white matter, okay? They're taking the information from the computer and putting it somewhere else, all right? So the gray matter's thinking, the white matter is taking those thoughts and directing them where they need to go. All right. So if somebody tells you, oh boy, this has been a gray matter kind of a day, that means they've had to do a lot of thinking, or my gray matter is hurting. They've been doing a lot of thinking that day. We divide it into two hemispheres, right? The right side and the left side, and they are actually connected by a lot of white matter. See the white matter there? They're going to be connecting over here. There's this big piece in here called the corpus callosum right here. It kind of reaches up a little bit, and it connects the two sides. It is true, so here we have two hemispheres. It is true that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and vice versa. The left side controls the right. And so that, you may have heard that before, and it is definitely true. Now, why it is that way, I'm not exactly sure. You can see right here, so my right side, the right hemisphere of the brain, is controlling my left eye, and my left hemisphere is controlling my right eye. Do you see we have the colors here? The pink or orangish color here. Notice how there's a little bit of that still left here, right? So it's not 100% crossover. This area is called the decussation. It's not 100% crossover, but it's a good amount of crossover there, okay? Right here as well. And those are just happen to be showing the eyes. But so like my right brain is controlling my left hand. So if you're left-handed, then you're more right-brained, you see. And so I will say that right-brained, left-handed people tend to have lots of creativity, musical abilities, things like this, because the right side of the brain tends to have more of those things. I also will say the vast majority of humans are right-handed. And the left hemisphere tends to control things like, logic and math and things like this. That doesn't mean that somebody who's right-handed can't be artistic. Not at all. It just seems that oftentimes left-handed people tend to be very artistic. So you may disagree with me on that one. Okay. We have three main parts of the brain. Okay, so we have down at the bottom we have the brain stem. Okay, that's kind of the beginning. It's kind of its own little miniature brain, really. We'll get to that. And then here we have this interesting little feature called the cerebellum. The cerebellum. And then we have the star of the show, the cerebrum. That's the whole wrinkly part right here. Okay, so we'll get to that. That's the part that makes us smart. Okay, makes us human and smart. Our cerebrum is much larger than other animals' cerebrum are. Okay, so that because we have much more intelligence than other animals have. All right, so we're going to cover these one at a time here. Let's see, we're going to start with the brain stem. So the brain stem, like it sounds, it's the stem. It's at the bottom there. I remember my mom, who was a critical care registered nurse, used to always tell us, well, if you think of your brain like an orange and you put your brain on a toothpick, think of your toothpick as like the brain stem and neck area. It's kind of vulnerable, right? You got to take care of it. This is the whole, you don't want to get your neck snapped around or anything like that. So the parts of the brainstem are three parts. We have the medulla oblongata, right down here at the bottom. I love that name, the medulla oblongata. Sometimes we just call it the medulla. We have the pons. Pons means bridge. And then the midbrain. Look where it is, smack in the middle of the brain. Along with this part up here, which we'll get to, called the diencephalon. And part of that you're seeing is corpus callosum, but the diencephalon includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and then this little gland hanging off the hypothalamus is called the pituitary gland, the most important hormonal gland in our body. So what does the brain stem do? It controls reflexes and autonomic functions. What does autonomic mean? It sort of sounds like automatic, doesn't it? We'll get to that's part of the PNS. We'll get to that. It's the involuntary things, and reflexes. Reflexes would be, where we're going to have a quick response. So instead of going all the way through the whole brain, for instance, a reflex. For instance, if you touch something hot and you pull your hand back really quickly because you find out it's hot, that has to do with reflex. Okay, I'll get to that at lab time. But it's mostly white matter. So what is the job then? If it's mostly white matter, what's the midbrain doing? It's communicating. It's taking whatever the brain told it and communicating it down. But I also mentioned it's kind of like a little miniature brain. Inside of it, there are at least four chunks called nuclei, and those are nuclei of gray matter. So that means it's going to be doing some of the commanding, right? Some of the thinking. So that gray matter is commanding things like your heart rate, and your breathing rate, and your ability to swallow. Okay? Those are all things that are fundamental survival things. So it's like a rudimentary parts of the brain to help us stay alive. All right? So even if this rest of your brain doesn't develop, this part of your brain will give you the rudimentary factors to stay alive. Okay? Your heart rate, your breathing rate, your ability to swallow, those kind of things. So pretty cool. The cerebellum is right down here. Okay, it kind of hangs off the end here. It's kind of an interesting little shape. It seems like it's an afterthought almost. But what is it responsible for? You can see this guy over here. It's responsible for movement and coordination. Okay, so it gives us, like, if you're going to be doing a task that requires a lot of movement, let's say like playing basketball, your cerebellum is going to be out there helping you keep all of those working in working order. And then our body position, that's just like you're sitting right now. This cerebellum it's kind of like helping you with your balance. Now, balance takes place in the ears, and we'll get to that next week. But it is helping you with that, so you know which way is up, which way is down, this kind of thing. So the cerebellum's working. If you're a really coordinated person, maybe you have a highly developed cerebellum. Then we get to the cerebrum. This is the star of the show, right? The diva. It can be divided, we've talked about this, into two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, and then, of course, into the lobes. Now, we saw this at the beginning where we have the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. There's the cerebellum, okay? and the brainstem right there. So it's kind of hard when you're looking at the brain to distinguish where the frontal lobe ends. Okay, except there is this giant groove here called, all these grooves are called sulci. Some people call them sulci, but sulci, but I call them sulci, and a single one would be a sulcus. This is the central sulcus. Now that's the little groove going down. Now the bump coming up is called a gyrus. So these are gyri and sulci. So this is the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. All right, so if we can establish where that is when we're looking at the brain, then we can figure out where the frontal lobe is and where the parietal lobe starts. Okay, we have a pretty good groove right here called the Sylvian fissure, which gives us the idea of where that temporal lobe comes out, and then it kind of sort of melts into this occipital lobe. Do you remember the occipital bone on the skull? So the occipital lobe is just underneath the occipital bone on the skull. And we also have our frontal bone and that kind of thing right there. So when we talk about these different parts in Biology 2, I go into some of the details that take place in each one of these lobes. All right, so the easy one would be the occipital lobe. It is responsible for vision. So our eyes are way over here, right? And our eyes come in and cross over, and they come and bring all the information to this back part of your brain. And that's where we're able to process visual information or light information. The light comes in your eyes, you see something, and so you're able to read it. You're able to, like for instance, if you see your mom come in the room, you recognize her. So there's a part of your occipital vision area that not only sees her, but remembers her. Okay, so that is part of the occipital. We have some interesting parts in our temporal lobe, one side and the other side. They have a lot to do with processing and understanding language. One of them would be putting words together. The other one would be understanding the words that somebody else is putting together. For instance, you're listening to me right now. There's part of your brain in your temporal lobe that is taking my words and you are making sense of them. You remember these words, you know what I'm saying, and then furthermore, hearing my voice over this, you recognize my voice. So there's a memory associated with that. The brain is amazing, y'all. It is so cool how God has developed this. All right, so here here they are again. I want to talk about the frontal lobe a little bit. Here in the frontal lobe, we kind of think of it as our personality part of our brain. We have memory in here. There's something deep inside called the hippocampus, which is responsible some way for our memory. And the frontal lobe right here and the prefrontal lobe right here, we think has to do a lot with our personality as well. Okay, so here we go. And the frontal lobe is part where we have associated with reasoning, planning, and also planning speech, planning the parts of speech we're putting together. It takes movement, and then in conjunction with the cerebellum, it makes that movement coordinated. We believe our emotions are here. That's part of our personality, right? The emotions. Problem solving. Okay, so the frontal lobe has a lot of action going on right there. There's a whole lot of, as you can see, a whole lot of area of the frontal lobe. It's pretty big, you know, so it's got all that stuff it's going to do. Okay. Then we have our parietal lobe, and it's associated with movement, orientation, recognition. There's that memory thing I was telling you about. Perception of stimuli. I can take, especially sensory stimuli, the sense of touch, and I know if you touch me on, the back, if you poke me in the back, I know you poked me in the back. What about getting stung by a wasp? I know where I got stung by a wasp. I don't have to see the wasp. I know I just got stung on the leg, because I feel it, and I can associate where it happened in my parietal lobe. Our occipital lobe, I talked about visual processing and memory. And our temporal lobe with like I said, the perception, recognition of auditory, that's hearing the words I'm saying, memory, remembering what words mean, and then speech and putting speech together there as well. We have some specialized areas called the Wernicke's area and the, what's the other one called? Yeah, Broca's area. Okay. All right, so I'm going to send this home. I'm going to, actually, not send it home. I'm going to email this to you. All right, so we're going to have the parts of the brain to label here. And so what you'll do is just hopefully have this in front of you, and I'll put this right here. So there you go. You can pause this video and you can fill in these parts right here. And I may ask you some questions like this on your quiz. And furthermore, remember, this information will also be on the final exam. Okay, so like I said, you can pause right there. All right, earlier I mentioned to you something called the blood-brain barrier. Okay, it turns out that blood is actually toxic to the brain. Isn't that weird? It's toxic to the brain. So it's important to keep the blood from actually touching the neurons. Weird. But also the blood-brain barrier is going to be a barrier that stops foreign substances from coming in. Like I said, it's kind of rare to have a brain infection. It's not impossible, but kind of rare. And so part of it is because I've got these cells that are working on this. Remember the astrocyte and stuff. So the blood-brain barrier is just a system that is protecting the brain from foreign things. It is protecting it from any neurotransmitters that aren't supposed to be there. It maintains a constant environment. So we see right here that we have like a little policeman, right? And he's saying, nope, nope, you can't come in, you know, because it's not something we want in the brain, right? So authorized molecules only. So let's break it down and figure out what's going on, okay? We're going to open up the blood-brain barrier. I will tell you there are things that do open it. For instance, if you've ever had a headache, this is kind of interesting. It's not your neurons that hurt, it's your microglia. It's those other things, those neuroglia, the microglia, the astrocytes, those kind of things that are hurting because they feel pain. But there are things that go through the blood-brain barrier. So if you've had a headache and you may have taken something for it, like a ibuprofen or something, the ibuprofen can pass through the blood-brain barrier, and that's how it gets to those cells, okay? So a lot of medications, that's why we use them, pain medications and things like that, because they will cross the blood-brain barrier. So let's see, I think you may be supposed to write a few of these things down here. Okay, so what things can cause a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier? So these would be things that would be bad for you, okay? Well, this one would be. If you're taking a medication that you need for something, that's good for you, okay? So hypertension is the same thing as high blood pressure, and it can open up the blood-brain barrier by just having too much force coming in there and creating areas where things can now sneak in that you don't want to come in. There could be a development problem. It's not fully formed at birth. That would be a defect. Hyperosmolality, it would be a high concentration of some substance in the blood, and it sort of knocks things off balance in there. So that can cause a blood-brain barrier breach. Microwaves, they can open it up and cause some damage, okay? Radiation obviously can cause damage. Infection, so if there's an infectious agent that takes over, namely something known as meningitis, it can cause inflammation and some damage to the blood-brain barrier there. Trauma, this would be you've been hit in the head, like we talked about a concussion earlier. Ischemia is a type of brain bleed. It's actually like an ischemic stroke. That's a type of stroke where you have blood just kind of seeping into your brain. So when the blood is hitting the brain tissue, like I said, it's toxic to it. It'll start to kill brain cells. So the blood-brain barrier is keeping brain cells from being damaged. And so if it breaks or if something's wrong with it, then brain cells can be damaged then. Sometimes inflammation can get in here and cause that, which causes pressure. So injury to the brain can cause, and that's once again back to that concussion, can lead to some damage to the blood-brain barrier, and we want to take care of it so that it doesn't get breached. All right. Okay, so that is the CNS. There's lots more about the brain, but for our classes, we don't need to know some of those details. But now we're going to move on to the peripheral nervous system. So if you see right here, the CNS is the brain and the spinal cord, right? But look at the PNS. Oh my goodness, there's so much to it. So we have two big divisions. The sensory division, what do you think that's responsible for? That would be senses, right? We'll talk about that all next week. Today we're going to talk a little bit about this, the motor division. So the PNS has the motor division. That's going to be movement and stuff, okay? So muscle movement and things. One of these divisions, it's broken down further to the somatic nervous system and the autonomic. Let's talk about somatic first. Somatic would be body. Somatic, soma means body. So the motor division would be responsible for what we call voluntary muscles. These are the muscles you're moving when you say, arm move, leg move, that kind of thing. It's also, though, the autonomic. I used that word earlier. We could think of it as automatic, but it's autonomic is the right word. And the autonomic nervous system is broken down further, oh my goodness, into two more divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So as you can see, the PNS gets rather complicated here. Okay, but we're still going to tackle it a little bit. The sensory part, that's kind of easy, comparatively speaking. We'll spend the whole week next week talking about the sensory part. We'll be looking at our senses and seeing how all that stuff works. It's very fun, very interesting to learn about that. But the autonomic nervous system is further broken down, okay? So this is the automatic. So in other words, these would be the involuntary muscles. For instance, your stomach when it's moving the food around, your intestines when it's using that peristalsis to move it through, or the peristalsis in your esophagus. All those things would be involuntary muscular movement, and that is taken care of by the autonomic nervous system. So when we break these into their two sides, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, they work kind of together. So the sympathetic tends to speed things up, and the parasympathetic tends to slow things down. Okay, so for instance, when I am speeding things up, I will, my pupil here will, it says it dilates. Okay, I thought it constricted. Okay, but that's being taken care of here. We have, this is interesting, the flow of saliva, let's think of sympathetic as stressed out, okay? It's more stressed. It's speeding things up because I'm stressed. So when it comes to saliva, this is kind of interesting. It really takes relaxation to get saliva to be going, okay? Because think, what are you doing when saliva is coming out? I'm sitting down, I'm eating a good meal, this kind of stuff, sort of a non-stress time. But when I'm in a stress time, I'm going to inhibit this flow of saliva so that I don't have, I'm not slobbering when I do speaking. For instance, have you ever had to give a speech in front of like your English class and you're a little bit nervous? Have you noticed that your mouth just seems to get really dry? Well, that's because your saliva is being inhibited by your sympathetic nervous system. How about that? I'm also maybe a little nervous, so my heart starts to beat a little bit faster. And we know from last time, when my heart starts to beat a little faster, what are my lungs going to do? Well, they're going to start breathing faster to keep up with the blood that's being pumped by the heart. That's all part of the sympathetic stressful part, sympathetic stress. And then parasympathetic, I'm calming down, my heart rate is slowing down, my breathing is slowing down, okay? And interesting here, because I'm like eating, look, I'm going to stimulate actually my peristalsis and my digestion. That makes sense, doesn't it? So when I'm more calm, I can digest my food. So you may have also noticed, like for instance, if you have a class right after lunchtime, you've eaten your lunch and you go to class and you're sitting there and you're like, oh, I feel so tired. I feel so sleepy. Well, that's because your parasympathetic nervous system is working on digesting your food. So it's kind of concentrating there and it's kind of nice and calm and this kind of stuff. Stimulate the release of bile to help digest my food. Over here, I'm going to, not do much of that, okay? I will have secretion of adrenaline from my adrenal glands on top of my kidneys because guess what? I'm a little bit stressed out. I need some adrenaline to get me going, right? That's called the fight or flight response. I'm going to run or I'm going to stay and fight kind of a thing. Also, look here, my bladder, right? If I need to relieve myself, the bladder needs to be relaxed. So then it can contract the bladder because my parasympathetic says I'm relaxed enough to release urine. Okay, here, no, not going to do it because I'm stressed out, right? So that's kind of the breakdown of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So here's the somatic. So somatic, of course, is when we're talking about senses. And one of the things about senses, okay, so our nerves are coming out here, right? They're coming from the thoracic vertebrae, all right? So my head and my neck, these are all going to be controlled by nerves coming out of here. My lumbar, I'm sorry, these are cervical. These are cervical. These are thoracic. And then my thoracic, my chest and my abdominal muscles are being controlled here. And down in the lumbar, my leg muscles. That makes sense. The further down it's controlling it. And then my bladder and all that right down here. So notice over here we have something known as the reflex. I'm going to show you this at the end, that if you hit the knee right here, it'll automatically make your foot kick up. And it just goes on this little short journey instead of having to go all the way back to the brain. It just goes right there, almost to the little, there's some gray matter right here in the spinal cord. Okay, so we can send that signal and it can make that signal go. All right, so it will cause your foot to kick without having to go all the way to your brain to do it. Sort of like when you pull your hand away from something hot. A similar deal. Remember, it's called a reflex. Okay, so we're going to be talking now about keeping our brains nice and healthy. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we're going to eat the right kind of foods. Once again, I'm going to preach at you about food, right? I do that all the time. So look what's good for our brain. So we'll call this brain food. I used to think brain food was like chocolate and nuts because I got the nuts. Yeah, oh no, yeah. I still say chocolate is one of the food groups, right? Okay, so here we go. Blueberries, wild salmon, nuts and seeds. There's our nuts. Avocados. Oh, how many times did we see avocados in our digestion unit? Pomegranate juice. That's interesting. So how about pomegranates, I guess? Beans and other legumes, whole grains, and hooray for dark chocolate. See, it is. It's healthy food for you. All right, so we call that brain food. It keeps your brain nice and nourished, this kind of thing. Okay, so now we're at the time when we'll be doing the lab for this class, and we're going to do a couple of these things right here. The first thing I'd like you to do is take your hands, okay, and I want you to fold your hands in front of you, like this. Fold your hands. Now tell me which thumb is on top. I'm looking at my hands and my right thumb is on top. Notice in the picture, that person right there has the left thumb on top, right? Okay, so whatever thumb is on top, that's going to be your dominant side right there. Even if you're left-handed, sometimes your right thumb will end up on top. Now I want you to take your fingers and do it the opposite. So I want you to put, so for instance, my right thumb is on top. I'm going to move it to where my left thumb is on top and my other fingers are intertwined down there the opposite way. Oh, have you done it? Does that feel weird? That feels so strange, doesn't it? Okay, so that's just talking about our dominant side. So if you were to go out and shoot a gun, sorry if that, let's say a pretend gun, okay, and you were holding the gun up, which eye would you start to focus through? You just take one eye and look through it, okay? So me, it's my right eye. Okay, so I'm right-handed, and then my right eye would be sighting this. My husband's right-handed, but he sights with his left eye, so it's kind of weird to bring his left eye all the way over. So that's a dominant eye right there. Also, think about this when you talk on the phone. If you put it to your head, although these days we don't put it to our head as much anymore, right? But which side do you put it to? Are you more comfortable listening through your right ear or through your left ear? And then, of course, we get down to our right-handed, left-handedness. Which hand do you prefer to write with, your left or right? If you're kicking a ball, which do you like to kick with, your left or right? So that just shows dominant side right there. Okay, the next thing we're talking about is a brain trick. I like to trick your brains a little bit. I think next week we'll do a little trick of the eyes, which is, of course, part of the brain, certainly part of the nervous system. And so what I have is this little thing, right? Oh, first is our reflex. So I would have brought this little hammer thing with me, and we would have kicked you in the knee, and we would see if that really happens. And, you know, it's funny, y'all, it really does. Yeah, just shows you a little reflex there. Kind of cool. But this right here, okay, these are words, and if I ask you I want you to tell me the color. So this word right here, so instead of reading that word, what would I say? I would say red. But it's kind of hard, right? Because I want to say blue, because I'm reading blue. But that's red, that's blue, that's green. Do you see what I'm saying? Red, yellow, blue. I almost said orange. Green, red, yellow, blue, and red, right? So, but it kind of tricks us because we're reading the words. This one's real easy for a younger kid who hadn't learned to read yet. They know the colors right off the bat, right? So it's kind of a brain trick right there where we've learned to read, so therefore it kind of sometimes overpowers the other things that we're looking at, right? So it's a way to trick your brain just a little bit. Normally I would have had a piece of paper I handed to you and had you do it. All right, let's watch a little video here. This is, you know what this is, y'all? This is a virtual dissection of the brain, really the gross anatomy, like the outside of it, okay? It's pretty cool, though. It's like a computer animated version of dissection instead of actually dissecting.
Hey everyone! Sophia from Visible Body here. In this video we're going to dissect the cerebrum and the outer structures of the brain. As always, I'll be using Human Anatomy Atlas. Alright, let's begin. I'm starting with a preset view that I made, which I'm going to grab out of my favorites. As you can see, we've got the skull and spinal column here, which respectively encase the central nervous system, aka the brain and spinal cord, aka the CNS. Using the system tray, I'm going to hide all the skeletal structures on the screen, so we're just left with the CNS. No, your eyes aren't playing tricks on you. The brain and spinal cord are encased in something. What you're looking at is dura mater, which is a thick sheath of connective tissue that protects the brain and spinal cord. Dura mater makes up the outermost layer of the meninges. Ever hear of meningitis? It's when the meninges become inflamed. Nasty thing, meningitis. Anyway, I'm going to hide the dura mater to get a better look at the CNS. Now you can see our lovely brain and spinal cord model here. The spinal cord is a thick, long bundle of nerves that has some really important functions. Think of the brain as central command, and the spinal cord as a sort of superhighway that sends the brain's commands and relays the body's messages back to the brain via the peripheral nervous system, aka all the nerves and ganglia outside of the CNS. Using the search tool, I'm going to add it to the model. The CNS and the PNS work together to control the body's motor, autonomic, and sensory functions. Let's hide the PNS and the spinal cord and move our way up. I'm going to rotate the model so we can see things from an inferior view. You can see the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the cerebellum. These structures make up the rhombencephalon, or hindbrain, and are responsible for controlling autonomic functions like breathing, the beating of the heart, and digestion, as well as fine-tuning body movements in terms of balance and posture. Okay, and now on to the main event, the telencephalon, or the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and is categorized into functional areas called lobes. It's divided by the longitudinal fissure into two hemispheres, right and left, and is connected by the corpus callosum, which you can kind of see in the fissure here. The four lobes of the brain are the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And both hemispheres of the brain have these lobes. The lobes are all named after the bones that cover them. The frontal lobe is where higher functions occur, like planning, problem solving, long-term memory, impulse control, and speech and language. The parietal lobe integrates sensory information and plays a role in spatial perception. Mine must be broken because I can't seem to leave a room without bumping into the doorway. The temporal lobe contains an auditory cortex that receives input from the cochlear nerve and is responsible for primary auditory perception. It's also associated with processing sensory input into derived meanings, like attaching emotion to visuals, like recognizing faces. You know that rush of love you get when you see a family member or friend? That's the temporal lobe's doing. Now, the cerebrum doesn't comprise just these four lobes. There are structures called gyri and sulci as well. A gyrus is a ridge or a fold between two clefts. Here's the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus, both between the frontal and parietal lobes. The gyri increase the cerebrum's surface area. The precentral gyrus contains the primary motor cortex and controls precise movements of skeletal muscles. The postcentral gyrus contains the primary somatosensory cortex and is responsible for spatial discrimination. There's a third, the cingulate gyrus, but it's part of the limbic system, which is another topic for another video. The sulci are fissures and separate the gyri. The more prominent ones separate the lobes. The central sulcus, or the fissure of Rolando, which is probably the coolest name ever, separates the frontal and parietal lobes. The less cool named lateral sulcus separates the parietal and frontal lobes from the temporal lobe. The parieto-occipital sulcus separates, you guessed it, the parietal and occipital lobes. And there we are, the cerebrum and some of the other structures of the outer brain. Stay tuned for the next video where we take a look inside. Thanks for joining me today. To receive...
Okay, and you notice how she pronounced those words a little differently than I did, solstice and solchi. Now, if we were looking at the brain, we'd be looking at a sheep brain. Remember, sheep are a little bit different, so their brain's not quite as round as ours is. But I would have taken it apart where you could see, so we saw now the external part. Look at the cerebellum. Isn't that interesting? Now look at the gray matter and the white matter. So remember that gray matter is doing all that coordination stuff. Look at the brain stem. Look at how white that stuff is there and the gray all around here like this. We can see the corpus callosum, white matter. There's the ventricle, right? There's where the CNS, the cerebrospinal fluid is being made right there. We have optic nerve. We have our, you can always see the pineal gland. Sometimes you can. But I'm looking for the hypothalamus right here. And hanging off the hypothalamus, you should see the little pituitary. Oh, that's it. Okay, that's big. That's a big pituitary gland right there. Okay, so I would have had this half a brain for you to look at today, and so it pretty much just looks like that. So it's remarkably unremarkable when you're actually taking it apart. Sometimes I'll actually dig into here and take that thalamus and hypothalamus out of there. You see how it reaches deeply in there. I also would have brought a little plastic model for you to take a look at, and we could see it that way. All right, in your little bag that I'm sending home, I'm also giving you all the stuff to make this. It's just a model of a neuron, okay? So you would have your cell body, which is already on there. Then you put some of those other beads on there and maybe this little thing at the terminal if you want to. You could just leave these beads on. By the way, those beads there are the kind that change color in the sunlight, so you can try that. Okay, so make that little model and then fill out that brain, sheet, and then you'll have your lab done for this week. Okay, gang. There we go. All right, I'll talk to you next week.